This year, we are following a theme of water and have organized various events and teaching around the topic. And this is the first in a group of conversations with faculty that we're calling Aquatic Meditations. So in the series this year, we're exploring how water functions in the work of our colleagues, particularly in this series, our colleagues in the humanities, arts, and interpretive social sciences. Water figures, from oceanic voyages to lives built around rivers, aquatic aesthetics to refugee migration, water shortage to floods, fluidity and flow, water conceived through sacred forms to aquatic life worlds and ontologies, representations of them. And so we wanted, in a sense, to understand how what water means in various fields, from the sense of the elemental, to the kinds of studies of flow and fluidity we see in something like oceanic studies that could encompass trade, adventure, piracy, empire, slavery, to thinking about imaginary notions of the transoceanic, multi-species ontologies, oceanic law, the law of the seas. So it's really extensive. Now, it's partly as a way of taking a topic like water that has become part of the study of the grand challenges, if you like, in disciplines that often doesn't actually look to the work that's going on in the humanities. And of course, there's such a lot of work that goes on in the humanities around these topics. Okay, so now to the business of today, really. I have asked our speakers to present on their thoughts on water for about 15 minutes each, and that will be followed by questions between the two speakers, perhaps, and among all of us. So, first of all, Sara Galetti, who will speak first, is Associate Professor in Art History and Visual Studies, and her work has included her monograph, Le Palais du Luxembourg de Marie de Médicis, Marie de Médici's Luxembourg Palace. The Luxembourg Palace now houses the French Seine, the upper chamber of the French Parliament. In fact, I had the pleasure of hearing Sara talk from her work in the Seine in Paris a few years ago, in 2012. Sara reconstructs the early history of the building from 1611 to 1631, including looking particularly at the center of the text at the royal apartment and the secretive nature of the inclusion of a wing of rooms, through this the restrictive and often secretive social life of the court. She also expands on architectural history and the influence of Italian architecture, specifically the Pitti Palace, on French classicism. And her thorough research provides different timelines to the accepted architectural history accounts gleaned through letters in the Florentine archives. She shows also, through architectural history, the paradoxical weakness of Maria's position as queen that she suggests is also made evident in the artwork by Rubens in the palace. Today, she's going to be talking about a different project, also based in the City of Light, but sometimes plunging its depths, the Paris of Waters project, which focuses on the impact of water on the demographic, social, architectural, and urban development of the city of Paris through time. She's also working on a book called Stereotomy, Mediterranean History, but I think she's going to focus on Paris today, right? Anne-Gaëlle Saliot is Associate Professor in Romance Studies. Her book, The Drawn Muse, is a study of the extraordinary destiny in the history of European culture of an object which could seem at first glance quite ordinary, she says, in the history of European culture. It tells the story of a mask, the cast of a young girl's face entitled L'inconnue de la Seine, the unknown woman of the Seine, and its subsequent metamorphoses as a cultural figure. Drawing on Walter Benjamin and specifically on his work on the art of collecting, also Abby Weinberg and Jacques Rancière in their emphasis on the materiality of history, she examines the figure of the mask and the drowned corpse itself as commodified object. She ranges over a whole history of works, from works by Louis Aragon, Man Ray, Blanchot, Julian Green, Modiano, Didier Blonde, and by the French New Wave cinema, poetry also. And the work ranges over analyses of the historical materiality of the Mars, questions of urban modernity, and also examines the inconnu as a cultural object, and the ontology and heuristic dimension of images. Her monograph Against the Grain, Godard, Rivette, Truffaut, and the 19th Century is, I think, forthcoming from Northwestern University Press in 2020. And she's also working on a book on the Tokyo Syndrome, Images of Japan in French Literature, Cinema, and Performing Arts from 1945 to the present. So just so you know who you're hearing today. So, okay, Sarah.
Many thanks, Ranji. I'm not sure how this works, but I'll try this way. That worked. Thanks, everyone, for being here, and thanks, Ranji, for inviting me, and thanks, Anne-Gaëlle, for letting me go first, because I see you actually have a paper. I don't, so I'll just keep, track of time. Part of the reason why I don't have a paper is that this is a project in its infancy, although it's a very long infancy. What you see here are the names of the undergraduate students that have collaborated to this project. So the project advance is based on how many undergraduates I find that I can, bribe into helping me with this. The project was born, in fact, very shortly before my book came out. I was a happy cat back then. I thought I had a book, and then maybe 6 months before it came out, when I had the first round of proofs already in my hands, I found a document in the archives that sort of told a whole different story. I'm very grateful that the publisher let me sort of put a hint to that story in the book itself, but that was Paris of Wharton, born right there. What you see, the subject of the book is this palace right here. Nobody knows it because it's occupied by the Senate, so you technically cannot enter it. So for years, while I was writing this book, I was explaining to people, well, I'm working on that thing that's at the end of the Luxembourg Garden, which everybody knows. What is interesting in this photo you see here is that you see a very modern city right behind. And the reason for that is that the Luxembourg Palace was in a rather peripheral location. Here is an aerial view from Google. The palace was here, and as you see in the early 17th century configuration of the city, this is the south bank, the left bank, and these were the city walls. So it was right outside the city walls. This is the document on your right that sort of threw me, the publisher, and everybody involved a bit up in the air. When I was in the archives looking for a couple of just, dates to be fixed, I found this object. I'd never seen an object like this before, partially because back then I was really not in the world of waters at all. This is a plan of the city of Paris seen from underground. So it's actually very similar to the plan you've seen in the first slide. The Seine is running north-south. That was the usual way in which many early modern city maps were oriented, where you would follow essentially the water going from above down. And so that is exactly how the Seine runs. And then, modernity, or early modernity, I should say, turned the north onto the upper side of the map. But so what happens here is that the author of this map indicates the river, the location of the bridges, one only building outside there, which is the Tuileries Palace, which doesn't exist anymore, but was linked to the Louvre, which is roughly here. And then everything else is water distribution networks, and so those are the lines you see. And then these dots are fountains, locations, or rather I should say, the location of where the aqueduct and the water distribution network is allowing for the water to come out into a fountain. And then you have little squares like this one, which are inspection places, places where you can access the network and make sure that it's running fine, things like that. These are sometimes tiny buildings. They can be manholes, but sometimes are tiny, rather sober, but, you know, for a manhole, a glorified manhole, imagine, in stone. What this document says is a very interesting story, in fact, about a palace itself, and that's why the publisher was kind enough to allow me, you know, 6 months delay. Maria de' Medici conceived this grandiose residence in the outskirts of the city, in the left bank. And when she did so, in fact, the left bank had no access to fresh water, to aqueduct water. The left bank, as many other parts of the city, but, you know, further away from centers of power, essentially was drinking well water. And as we all know, well water can be dangerous, and it's rarely enough. So Maria de' Medici, as part of her residence planning, decided to restore, in fact, bring back to function an ancient aqueduct, and you see it arriving here, which was a Roman aqueduct, bringing water from a tiny place called Rangy, which is about 10 miles south of Paris, into the city. So this restoration project was quite impressive. It was this idea that we're going to bring back, you know, ancient Roman infrastructure per se is quite impressive, but it also was impressive in the way it was carried out. It was, in fact, a joint venture of Queen money, city money, and then private entrepreneurs who participated in the construction of what you see here, of the entire network that then included, you know, several pipelines and about 24 public fountains that would bring fresh water for free to the inhabitants of the left bank. These were not very monumental objects, and by now most of them have been lost, but you see here one example of what one of these fountains would have looked like. Of course, the network was also fed essentially through the part of financing that was the Queen's responsibility, a number of noble men and women and their households. So what is striking about this is that Maria de' Medici brings water to a part of the city that was far lagging behind in terms of urbanization and density than its opposite on the north. So now we have moved into modern maps, and so you see the Seine running horizontally. Sorry, I want to jump to... Okay, so here you see the difference between, there's a century between these two maps. And you notice here, before that project, the left bank was a rather small part of the city compared to the right bank. It consisted of 3/4 as opposed to 13 on the other side. So not only was smaller, you know, topographically, but it was much less dense in number of inhabitants. What you see a century later is that that imbalance has almost completely balanced itself. What happens is there's the construction of the aqueduct. So households that, as nowadays, you know, the wealthier households actually consume the most, felt like they could actually buy lots and move onto the left bank. But also, there's a number of urban interventions, which you see here highlighted in yellow, which are carried out by the female members of the royal family mostly, including Maria de' Medici, but also the first wife of Henry IV, Marguerite de Navarre, Margot, famous from the movie, mostly, I guess. What you see up there is, in yellow, the interventions that Henry IV himself implemented in the city of Paris. And as traditional urban history goes, these are squares, buildings, and architecture historians tend to focus on these objects, on objects that are, well, first of all, visible, above ground, that have a certain sort of dignity in terms of architectural style or novelty. What you see down here are the other projects, and we're talking about private residences with large, publicly accessible gardens. You have to imagine a thick city where finding an open space was not, an accessible open space was not, your daily experience of the city. And what you see is that they start building a number of bridges. That is also very important because what happened in the medieval city and up to the end of the 16th century is that the Seine acted like a barrier. And with the construction of bridges in the 17th century, through the 17th century, in fact, this barrier becomes permeable. What does that mean? It means that if you lived in the left bank before the construction of all these bridges, you were theoretically very, very far from the Louvre and other centers of power, even if you could see them, because the only bridges were concentrated on this island, essentially. With the expansion of the new bridges, the city becomes, it becomes much easier to access the center of powers, even if you live across the river. So it's an operation that sometimes urbanists call a zipping up of parts of the city that are technically close to each other, but in fact distant. What interests me in this is also that there's clearly a focus on the river itself. One other aspect that was curious about medieval and up to the end of the 16th century Paris is that you couldn't see the Seine from the bridges. The bridges were built, there were houses on them. I have this beautiful document from an Italian ambassador who's on the Pont Neuf and asks a French passerby, where is the Pont Neuf? And of course he gets made fun of for the next 20 years. But that gives a sense of what the perception of the river and the city and their relation was, or rather wasn't. So it is in the early 17th century, really, that Paris becomes the thing that we sort of think of, a city on the river, as opposed to a city next to a river. So after that, I just started thinking that there are two types of urban history that we see very often. On the one hand, there is the architecture historian urban history, and I'm thinking of the early modern cities urban history, that focuses on buildings, styles, squares, visible things that though have no structural impact on the city itself. And on the other hand, you have the social historians who work on infrastructure, but tend to focus on the post-Ancien Régime because of availability of archives also, but also, I guess, because nobody has tried to put together those two in a way in which an urbanist would think of a city nowadays. You cannot think of a city without thinking of infrastructure. So that is a very long way to say why and how the Paris of Water project was born. So one reason why I wanted to do this project with students rather than on my own is that on my own I'm working on stone vaults, and so it's a bit distracting to go from one to the next. But second, because I think it's a perfect example of how you can actually teach students about a different way to think about a historical problem, but also letting them access to primary sources. There's a lot of this material that is available online, even for students who cannot go to Paris. and also because it has an interesting visualizing component, and I'm running this project in the Wired Lab, so that is also an interesting part of teaching for me with this. So we're looking at the waters and their impact on the structure of the city of Paris, and by structure I mean physical, but also social and demographical, before the beginning of the 19th century, essentially. We're looking at water in a variety of expressions, both positive and negative. So on the one hand, you have to think the Seine is a place through which life gets to Paris. And I'm talking about food, firewood, wine. When the Seine used to freeze in winter, there was no wine in Paris. You have to imagine that, right? It's like a traumatizing experience. So you were cold, hungry, and sober. But also, of course, the Seine is, and more so the more global warming advances, a threat, in fact, to the city itself and its inhabitants. And so what you're looking at here is an 1821, I believe, yes, map of the flood of the Seine. What is very interesting is that there's a difference. I don't know if you can really see them, but there are green lines and then red lines, okay? So the parts in blue are the parts of Paris that are flooded. Those that are contoured in green are the parts that are flooded because the river is coming out. So they're flooded from above. The parts that are contoured in red are the parts that are flooded from below. So clearly the Seine is finding a number of ways to access basements and sometimes ground floors even, using the sewage system and the water distribution system, essentially going the opposite way. There's also a number of maps that show how this anxiety about the river prompted a number of attempts at constructing canalization so that a flood of the Seine would essentially be taken up by canals that were designed to go around the city and then put back that water into the Seine past Paris, and who cares about everybody down the line. This is, and here I have to really shout out to one of my students, Andrew Lynn has spent, was a fabulous young historian, has spent a year looking at sewage. And my heart goes out to him. This was, of course, one of the biggest threats to the very health of the inhabitants of Paris. And so we follow through a number of maps how the city uses water to clean its own streets, which some contemporary cities still do, in fact, but also how it starts building a series of canals, in this case, this one, to collect that sewage and, again, make it go around the city and back into the Seine, and again, who cares about whoever comes down the line there. And what that does is that, in fact, there's an entire sort of buffer, like the smell buffer zone, I call it, around here where people don't live. There are agricultural lands and things like that, things that actually can use sewage to their own advantage rather than. Of course, we're looking also at water as a positive thing, and so we're looking at maps of the water distribution network. This is 1821. You see different colors. The different colors indicate where the fresh water is coming from. Some of it is coming from the Seine itself with a system of pumps, and then some of it is coming from two aqueducts. One, the aqueduct I was mentioning at the beginning of this presentation, which comes down from the south, and then there's another one that comes down from the north. We have earlier versions of these maps in fact, where you see the networks sometimes, like in this case, not differentiated, but still you see the various fountains and glorified manholes. We're going back in time, back to, in fact, the full view of the original Dégaudet end of the 17th century map that started this all. Now I have a student, Dryden Quigley, who is technically, I think, the smartest person I've met in the past 20 years, who's working, no kidding, who's working on georectifying these early modern maps onto the modern Google map of Paris, and finding exactly where these networks were. Sometimes they're still there nowadays, sometimes parts of it have disappeared. She's locating the various fountains, and she's doing this for all the maps that we have, for all the data, in fact, even when it's not on maps that we have. And she's including wells. This is an extraordinary visualization, by the way. These are two cross sections that run both north-south in Paris through, in this case, the Pont Notre-Dame and the Rue Saint-Martin. And they show in the section itself, like here, you know, you have the street up here, you have the water, how do you call it? The source of water that is like underneath. The water table, thank you. And these are the wells. So people were, you know, surveying every single well, every single source of water. So Dryden is putting also this system onto the map. And essentially, she's building a mega map of the distribution of water in Paris that is associated with a timeline so that you could see not only how it develops, but also what the different sources are. She's almost at the end of it, and the goal essentially, because we have also some technical drawings that give us not all the information, but enough information on the size of these pipes, on the diameters, and therefore on, and also on the amount of water that was going through them. She's now working with a colleague from the University of Turin to build a mathematical model of actually sort of a dynamic model of how that system worked, to understand where water would actually get, where water would actually not get, and who would be advantaged from a geographical point of view in accessing what is one of the most important resources for early modern cities, but modern and contemporary cities too. So here's where the infant is. Thank you.
So I would like to thank Renji for having invited me, and also I would like to thank Sara for a great talk. So obviously I'm talking from a very different standpoint because it's a book I published more than 3 years ago. It was a complete project. It was something that occupied me for many, many, many years. So I will try to condense in 15 minutes, but I have to say this is very difficult in that case. So I'm going to do my best. Okay, so let's start with that because that's a photomontage by Albert Rudomine of L'Inconnu de la Seine. So for you just to have an idea of what I'm talking about, and you know, I think it's always good to have images in that instance. So, having written a book on a famous, unknown, and ever resurfacing drowned woman, I believe that the question of what water means for me is intrinsically related to the experience of writing the Drawn Muse. In this book, I followed the voyage of the drowned girl's image art on across the 20th century and its multiple undercurrents. In the search for this modern muse who has been both literally and figuratively drawn, I have had to dive into time, so to speak, and to descend to the seabed of my own present. While exploring the latter, I remembered Hannah Arendt's beautiful description of Walter Benjamin's, inspired by Shakespeare's The Tempest, as a pearl diver collecting thought fragments from the depth of the past. And that's the quotation here that you have. Like the pearl diver, I have attempted to bring this drawn muse back to the surface, not to resuscitate her, but to bring to light the crystallization of the text and images that emanated from her thereby offering my contemporaries my own collections of uncanny thought fragments. More pertinently to our discussion today, the Drawn Muse views the Inconnue de la Seine as belonging to the manifold traces that constitute the palimpsest of the city, and examines her as a textual and visual relic, documenting the emergence of modernity in late 19th century Paris and its impact in the 20th and 21st centuries. It was my contention that the Inconnue has to be related to the miscellany of everyday life, to the discrete images that for Walter Benjamin make an epoch legible to the historian. The mask is both sign and symptom of a particular legibility of Paris, covering time and space, discourse and topography, and the impact of the discursive and visual figure of the Inconnue stems from its deployments, from the deployments of its formation inside a material and textual topography. In his 1935 lecture preceding Paris, capital of the 19th century, Benjamin claims, I quote, and that's also it is the unique provision of Baudelaire's poetry that the image of the woman and the image of death intermingle in a third, that of Paris. The Paris of his poem is a sunken city, and more submarine than subterranean. The knotic elements of the city, its topographic formations, the all-abandoned bend of the Seine, have evidently found him a mold. Decisive for Baudelaire in the death-fraught ideal of the city, however, is a social, a modern substrate. This passage, which raises the question of lyric poetry in the 19th century urban context, is a key insight into the legibility of the Inconnue de la Seine as muse. The Inconnue is related to the urban through a series of imaginary associations prompted by the particular phase in the process of urban gelibility. It is the trace of an imaginary topography where anonymity, death, and femininity intermingle. This intermingling is an allegory for the death ideal of the city, the latter being the precise point at which the concrete social and historical determinations of the mask intersect with the mythical element produced by a topographical imprint. The contiguous and imaginary link between the woman and the river, materialized by the figure of the drawn girl, appears as an echo of previous texts dealing with the feminine and codified spatial representations of Paris. It is no coincidence if the mask, in its uncanny aspect, has principally fascinated men who write about Paris, men who implicitly relate the mysterious and ungraspable entity of the city to an elusive feminine figure. Today, I would like to evoke briefly again the concrete localizations of discursive constellations, and more precisely, the ways in which two specific places of the Parisian cartography, the Morgue and the Seine, have been interrelated. These two places in the material history play host to a variety of different discourses. The Morgue, where anonymous bodies are exposed in hopes of identification, and the Seine, with the many corpses, some murdered, some dead by their own hand, some accidentally dead, which it carries along and conceals. In 1989, on the occasion of the bicentenary of the French Revolution, and a year after his film Drowning by Numbers won acclaim at the Cannes Festival, Peter Greenaway shot Les Morts de la Seine, the Dead of the Seine. The subject of the film was a simple one, a catalogue of dead people fished out of the Seine and then exposed at the Basse-Jaule of the Châtelet in the late 18th century. The starting point for the project was an essay by the historian Richard Cobb, who discovered and deciphered the funerary notes of all the cadavers found in the Seine between 1791 and 1805. Compiled by two employees of the Basse-Jaule, these notes, which included meticulous records of all the traces found on the bodies, came to constitute a considerable archival achievement. Greenaway explains his curiosity about the face of anonymous people in times of historical change and the minute and scattered traces they left behind them when they died. His approach places great emphasis on the appreciation of visual traces. I quote him, "As the film shows, the information was largely visual, established from the examination of bodies. I wanted to create a kind of reconstitution in order to discover from these very scarce elements who these people were, and above all, what they were doing in the Seine." This attempt at reconstitution prefigures the many narratives on the Inconnu de la Seine, themselves preoccupied with recreating from the mere trace of a death mask, a historical and social identity for the young girl. Greenaway thus reveals the prehistory of the Inconnu's resonance for over a century. The Bajol is indeed viewed by historians as a precursor of the morgue that was situated on the Île de la Cité, on the Quai du Marché Neuf, where the Inconnu is said to have been exposed on blocks of ice. And I'm just going to show you just a clip from... Can you hear me well, by the way? Yes? Okay. So, perfect. Just...
In memory of Hippolyte Bayard's self-portrait as a drowned man. From April 1795 to September 1801, 306 bodies were taken from the River Seine in Paris and temporarily placed in the Basse-Jole morgue opposite the Île de la Cité. It can safely be presumed that whether through accident, misadventure, suicide or murder, all the bodies taken from the river met death violently, though not all may have drowned.
I'm just going to show you the end of the film. I mean, it's not like there are spoilers,
no
really.
Exists because it is no longer measured. This television tape is almost as perishable as ink on paper, and the world is 1,000 times more populated and 10,000 times as busy. Who will remember us? Who will speculate on our existence in 200 years' time? And who will remember these people who've lain very still, attempting to deny their bodies the semblance of life in order to impersonate the dead? It is pertinent that the record of the deaths of these unfortunates fitted a new and bold way of measuring time, the calendar of the revolutionary era. But in the same year as the mortuary notes ceased, so did the calendar. It could be said that these bodies that floated in the Seine did so in a time that no longer exists because it is no longer measured.
So you've seen that it's a very simple dispositif. It's just people, actors, feigning they're dead, and you have the archives that you have read out loud, and you have speculations about what happened, kind of forms of reconstitution. Beyond this specific preoccupation with ordinary lives and death, Greenaway reveals further in interviews the motivation behind the project, that of the omnipresence of death in film, and more especially of the liminal space between death and life embodied in cinema. Les Morts de la Seine accounts for the success of cinema as public entertainment and touches one of the most important features that would make the Inconnu de la Seine successful as a commodity, the equivocation between life and death, or to be more exact, the blurring of art and life expressed in the morbid drive for the inorganic, which is continuously underscored by Benjamin in his analysis of flourishing mass culture in fin siècle Paris. Critics have read the Paris Morgue as both a phenomenological and historical structure, predating cinema as entertainment. Bewildering, perhaps, the corpses exposed at the morgue were commonly called les figurants. The same word is still used to designate the secondary actors or extras in films. Anonymous, often restricted to motionlessness and nearly invisible in their paradoxical visibility, they evoke the immobile bodies that were theatrically exhibited at the morgue. The inconnu thus occupies an interstitial space delimited by the phenomenological, historical, and cinematic representative apparatuses. Indeed, the discursive configuration of the inconnu is established as if on a series of historical facts. A body has supposedly been pulled from the Seine and displayed at the morgue in Paris. Yet, the registers of the morgue remain stubbornly mute on this event. And it's been, verified multiple times by multiple historians, and we've never found a trace of her in the archives of the morgue. None. The inconnu de la Seine is connected with the morgue through the symbolism attributed to that space and the ways in which that space informs the contemporary perception of reality. Such connections are thrown into sharper relief when we turn to an examination of the historical evolution of the morgue. And I'm just going to give a bit of historical context about the history of the morgue and how it actually relates to the Seine. The morgue, what is known as the new morgue, was inaugurated in 1804 on the Île de la Cité, on the Quai du Marché Neuf. So it's actually very close to Notre-Dame de Paris. So it's really right in the historical center of the city, precisely on the Quai de l'Archevêché. It was open to the public from morning to evening every day of the week until 1907, when it was officially closed for moral reasons. The authority finally wanted to stop the macabre exhibition of corpses. The public exhibitions of cadavers had existed, of course, since the Ancien Régime, but the new morgue differed from its predecessors in that the visibility of the corpses was scientifically conceptualized and ordered as to allow them for their identification. The increasing anonymity of the urban masses was indeed an issue for the state, which had to face a new phenomenon of anonymous death, and a lot in the river, in fact. The morgue participated in the vast work of regulating the everyday life of the metropolis. It was considered by its contemporaries as a necessary complement of the registry office. The Paris morgue became part of the state machinery. Its new role also corresponded to unanticipated manipulations of cadavers in the 19th century that originated from a political will to discipline bodies on other space, as Foucault has, very powerfully demonstrated. The exhibition of dead bodies at the morgue is highly reminiscent of the panopticon system depicted by Foucault in Surveiller et Punir. The bodies were collected and displayed in La Salle d'Exposition, while the public stood in a room separated by a large window. The exhibition room was known as La Maison de Verre, the glass house. In short, corpses were displayed as if in a shop window. The glass house has also strong affinities with Foucault's description of the panopticon as a transparent building. Treating as inorganic objects, the bodies represents the acme of commodity fetishism. In the best year of the institution, the number of visitors was estimated to be around 1 million per year, a figure comparable to the annual numbers of visitors today to Parisian museums. And I think that's something which is always striking to be remembered. The institution became, in popular parlance, the Death Museum. Between 1825 and 1879, and it's what the historian Vanessa Schwartz has established, nearly every guidebook contained either a reference, a long and detailed description, or even an entire section on the morgue. A fin de siècle journalist even affirmed that, I quote, the morgue belongs to the list of catalogue curiosities of things to be seen, in the same way as the Eiffel Tower, Yvette Guibert on the catacombs. As a result, tourists flocked there, moth agape, drawn by the morbid eroticism of the naked corpse, because the corpse remained naked until 1877. The images conjures up the flaneur, his roving eye and fascination for the organic. Here, anonymous bodies are transformed into lifeless commodities, displays as objects delivered up to the gaze. But I think what's particularly fascinating, and I'm going to hurry up because I feel I'm going to lack some time otherwise. There was a continuous kind of dialogue or interaction between the popular press of the time and the morgue. People will come to the morgue because you will have a fait divers in the press. So, and of course, you had a lot of stories that were imagined coming out of the morgue. So the morgue became as this kind of really legendary place because of the literature that was also circulated on the morgue. But more pertinently to the object of our study today, the morgue was particularly famous for its display of drowned bodies, the numerous drowned bodies that were fished out from the Seine. And you can imagine why, because, and I'm sure that Sara knows about that, is that the Seine was a place of labor. It was a place when, commodities circulate. So you had a lot of accidents of people who were working on boats. You had also a lot of crimes because, yes, you could always conceal a body in the river. So it's coming from, an absolute historical fact that there were a lot of drowned bodies at the morgue. The photographer Nadar used to call la morgue armoire de noyés, salon des refugés. It's hard to translate. The drowned people cabinet, art salon for disqualified artists. I mean, you had a lot of jokes which were circulated on that aspect. And in 1840, Hippolyte Bayard, and I'm just going to, made his autoportrait en noyer. And you might have you might have noticed at the beginning of Greenaway's piece that he dedicated it to Hippolyte Bayard, autoportrait en noyer, which is this one. It's from 1840. It plays very openly with the popular representation of the morgue. You show him as one of the unknown bodies, pulled from the Seine. His clothes are hung up. They will always be, when there will be exhibition of corpses. He's half flying. His genitals, of course, are covered. And you have an interesting, you can read the kind of thing that he wrote to accompany the photograph. This photograph has become extremely famous in the history of photography because it's often been read as the first photographic fiction. But it was also, a political strategy from Bayard. He was marginalized by the success of the daguerreotypes. And so in order to attract attention to his own way of process of fixing the photographs onto paper, he invented this fiction. And it's, of course, as a parodic, realistic effects. But it completely reveals the theatrical nature of the morgue and its connection to the river. Ophelian echoes are, of course, interlocked with the imaginary dimension attached to the morgue. Indeed, most of the drowned were women. It appears that the attraction exerted by the morgue worked through a particular form of mythical suggestion, namely the Ophelia complex. The topography traced by the mask is also marked by the association of death, woman, and water, an association to which Gaston Bachelard gives a poetic interpretation in his very famous book, L'eau et les rêves, Water and Dreams. Here, river, woman, and death come together as three elements, subtending a representation of a city as a moving yet mythical geography. A historical and imaginary link between the morgue and the Seine is also revealed in this mythical association. It is important, in fact, to emphasize that Les Morts de la Seine enjoy considerable popularity thanks to the interactions between the morgue and the Parisian river. The presence of a metaphorical and metonymical association between the river and the dead woman is a constant feature of the narratives and films on the Inconnu de la Seine that treats the depiction of the city as a structural paradigm for the unconscious. The mask is a symptomatic figure through which it becomes possible to read the homology between the city and the unsaid of a given period. This homology is never made clearer than in the specific symbolism attributed to the river, which serves to materialize and join together both the legibility of the psyche and the legibility of a given period. The locus of the river is a fundamental poetic image of space-time, a chronotope joining permanence and change, eternity and destiny. In the Drawn Muse, and Ranji has mentioned this already, I have studied several literary works and films that provide with a rich treatment of this. Among these, you had Julian Green's Paris, Aragon's novel Aurélien, in which its dispersed and complex representation of Paris works as a locus and a figure for the unhappy consciousness of the interwar period, but also Cortázar's Raruela of Scotch, and the first narrative of Modiano's in his collection of short stories Des Inconnus, with its oblique designation of a tormented post-colonial context. In fact, the river and the Inconnus de la Seine work there as gesturing towards the Algerian War, but that's not something I'm going to develop today, but it's something that's interesting to know at least. I would like to end today with just going briefly to a film, which is Jean Vigo's La Talente, which I'm sure many of you have seen. There is this very famous underwater scene, but I could not resist. But I thought it was also extremely pertinent to the subject of the Seine and the city. The year 1934 was not only the peak of the Inconnus de la Seine's fame, it was also possibly one of France's darkest moments in the interwar period. Workers in the north were protesting against poverty, and the Stavisky scandal, which inspired Alain Resnais for his eponymous film, was just around the corner. It was during the harsh winter of that year, just prior to his death, that Jean Vigo shot what would become a cinematic event of legendary proportion, La Talente. Cut and manipulated by censors after Vigo's death, La Talente, whose original reels have disappeared, had long remained a mysterious and obscure film known principally to the cinephiles who frequented Henri Langlois' Cinémathèque Française. There had been as many different versions of La Talente as there were copies until an hitherto unknown copy, left relatively unscathed by censorship, was found in 1990 at the BFI National Film Archive. Despite the aura of secrecy and censure that surrounded the film following its release, it had actually been commissioned. That commission had certainly been prompted by contemporary interest in life on the case of the Seine. The Marinier, Bargeman, brought into fashion by the impressionist Renoir Père and Maupassant, had become influential figures among popular audiences during the interwar period. And integral elements of the urban scenography, that might be mine, in fact. Yeah. Paintings were reproduced, songs were composed, and narratives were written about them. I'm really sorry. However, instead of producing a cliched representation, Vigo offers a complex cinematic portrait of a couple of mariniers, Jean and Juliette, who, as they travel along the Seine, experience married life and the fascination exerted by the city. And I'm just going to play the film. So again, the sound doesn't work, but to be honest, it's not, well, it's okay. I think you could deal with that. But I can't find the video. Yeah.
Oh, ça marche bien, mais... Oh.
Patron, c'est foutu à l'eau!
Patron, c'est foutu à l'eau?
Patron, c'est foutu à l'eau!
Comment le patron, c'est foutu à l'eau?
it's just, I think, absolutely fantastic. I can never get tired of that scene. So you see this beloved woman, because it's Juliet, she becomes this kind of floating and moving apparition, reminiscent of Abby Warburg's Nymph. You have this also, I mean, it's extremely well done in terms of what we could do in cinema at that time. You have this irregular camera movement who produce a kind of vision of Juliet as an aquatic creature, an aerial unveiled dancer, which is very similar to Loy Fuller's Serpentine Dance. I just, preparing for today, I thought about what Gilles Deleuze says about many French films from the 1920s when he talks about the importance of water and how it works in the use of la coupe mobile as, in fact, an abstract liquid, an abstract environment for any kind of thinking about movement or what movement could be. So just an aside. And I'm concluding now. So the anachronistic temporality of the mask, the way in which it resurfaces over the course of even more than a century, with an alternating blend of persistence and effacement, makes it a kind of spectral figure particularly at home within the representational scheme of 20th century film. The mask of L'inconnu de la Seine reminds us of the fantastic and fantasy-like dimensions of cinema, its capacity to produce ghosts and evanescent apparitions. The hovering and spectral presence of the drawn girl incarnates the glistening movement, the ebb and flow, the presence and the disappearance of the filmic image. It entices us with impossible desire to immerse ourselves in the luminous chemistry of the film. Thank you very much.
I'm very interested in this question of the subterranean versus the submarine, as it were. And I was struck by the flood map image, of course, the water coming up from below. But then also, Anne-Gaëlle, in your talk, there's sort of the movement of the water as the Seine's surface, if you like, or the Seine's depth. And so I was just wondering if you could maybe Sara, you could start with sort of this thinking about whether water for you in your work is really about and whether water in infrastructural studies is about the subterranean and the surface and not really the submarine, or whether it is. Okay, and then maybe you could talk a little bit about surface and depth. Maybe that's 4 questions, but just to get us going.
Why me first?
You went first.
What I find fascinating in that flawed aspect is that it is outside of maps. It is the one place where we get a sense of these two worlds actually existing, right? The invisible subterranean and the city above. The way we perceive cities is actually often very far away from the way they actually function in topographical, geographical, and in terms of water too. So one of the things that struck me when I first saw that map is that I had just come back from a conference in Paris. There had been not a flood, but the Seine was very, very high. And I was in a taxi cab very far away from the Seine, near, in fact, the hill of Montmartre. And the cab driver said, "Oh, you see, it's flooded here. It's the Seine from the water." And I thought, oh God, I'm yet again in a car driven by a drunken man. And in fact, I saw exactly the same puddles in this map. So it is very interesting how the city at times, in very unexpected ways, shows you signs of its underbelly, let's say, and it's a very strange way to realize that we're dealing with a living organism that is not exactly what we think of cities in terms of, they're constructed, there's cement, there's buildings, there's pavements, and we imagine cities as more of rocky objects and sort of stuck, fixed objects, whether man-made or natural-made. But and this subterranean actually is reminded to us on relatively few occasions, but it's a very powerful way, I think of a city as something that is not in fact fixed, is not in fact rock. It's mostly water-based in essence, not only in the needs of its population and in the uses, in the fears, in the anxieties, but in its very nature. So that is what and I also apologize to the taxi driver in retrospect.
Yeah, well, I mean, in terms of flooding, it was actually quite fascinating, working on that book, which, the subject was not always happy, of course, as you might imagine. But she seems to resurface historically this figure when there are floodings. So it's interesting that she's also symptomatic of something very physical happening to the city and really related to the concrete mapping of the city and related to the story of infrastructure. So of course, there's a metaphorical dimension of this idea of her resurfacing with floodings. And I was actually, listening to you, I was thinking of this series of collages by Max Ernst, Une semaine de bonté, which is a series of surrealist collages organized around days. And you have one day, I cannot remember which one it is, which is about the Seine on the river, and it's flooded. And you have everything that is, hidden by the bourgeois, by the bourgeois convention, which is kind of released and unleashed with just the water. It's a very beautiful photo montage, so I just thought about that. But I think it's interesting that the flooding is something physical that can also, make resurface apprehensions, imaginary constellations, but at the same time that they can be used as a metaphor of discovering what is subterranean to the city.
So, because you have been talking about this subterranean dimension, I was wondering, since you mentioned that the bringing the water on the left bank of Paris was basically also a sign of power. So I was wondering how, if this sign of power is visible in these fountains, which are actually very discreet in Paris, so often against the walls, so yeah, this is so if this could be also read as a symbol, this kind of fountains, which on the same time, yeah, they're visible but not that much, and how this works within the city. And Anne-Gaëlle, very different question, because of course the morgue was in Paris a place where, a very fashionable place where people would go to look at these bodies. And there is also this erotic central dimension, which is very, very strong, and artists were influenced by, of course, to depict, for example, living bodies. If I think of Manet's Olympia, is a clear example of how
she was compared to a body
absolutely by the contemporary critiques, etc. So I was wondering if this fascination, in particular for dead people dead in the Seine, can be seen as a way of, a fascination of bodies that still seem alive. These are bodies which are not really wounded, which seems asleep, so there is this living dimension, especially if we think also of what you just said about the flooding as a kind of rebirth, or I don't know. Just
No, I think it's a really interesting. I mean, do you want to go first? Maybe?
No, go ahead.
No, okay. You sure?
Yes.
No, I think it's a very interesting question because, in fact, and this is the whole story about the inconnue de la Seine. I mean, you've seen her face. I mean, it's kitschy. Huh? She looks very like she has this, matted eyelashes. She has these beautiful cheekbones. She has this beautiful smile. She appears as if she's asleep. Well, in no ways a proper drawn body could look in that manner. It's not possible. I mean, even if a body has said just some hours in water, it's swollen. And so, and you have, I mean, I've actually scored the archives of the morgues, and I've really read a lot of essays about scientists at that time, which were obsessed about the drawn bodies at the morgue. There was one essay which was la putréfaction des corps dans l'eau. So they know that there was something very scientific about it and very gruesome and very. So it's interesting that it runs completely contradictory, this experience, to yes, this obsession, this imaginary projection on the drawn of the Seine as being alive, as being like Ophelia, beautiful dead, like the romantic death, like the perfect romantic death. Because it's incomplete. It's more than a discrepancy. It's jarring, very, very strongly, because it's also, in terms of the history of representation of death, the 19th century is also a moment in which the evolutions of corpses were extremely well studied, and the morgue was a place for that as well for scientists. So.
I'm just thinking that there's also, to me, it makes me think of, religious background to all this.
Yes.
In fact, the
Yes.
saint body that doesn't.
Yes. Yeah.
So there's that. Anyway, I will use her face in all my projects from now on. I think that she beautifully actually represents that sort of source of anxiety, but also of life that they. So
it's interesting because many philosophers have used her images.
There you go.
Yeah, Blanchot, Zizek did.
To go back to your question, Susanna, it's hard to answer because, in fact, most of these fountains have been, in time, dismantled, rebuilt, changed, So, in fact, I think there's about a couple of them that may date from the first half of the 17th century, where most of them were built in the left bank, and that was one of those. My understanding from, we have some descriptions, is that these are not particularly monumental objects, possibly to the contrary of what one may expect. So, if we think of, I don't know, the Medici Grand Dukes bringing water to the city of Florence with, his extraordinary monumental objects that also happen to be fountains. That is not at all the way in which these objects functioned. And I wonder if the fact that, they were probably seen, and correctly so because of their financial participation into the venture, as civic objects that the city of Paris was providing its own citizen. And so I guess that the monumental is maybe, willfully missing from, that sort of grander scale of,
Off of that, is there in the data collection and in the visualizations, is there a distinction that the students and yourself are making between? Are you cataloging both, or mapping both the monumental fountains that were constructed and connected to this network, as well as these more utilitarian spigots that are around the city? Or is there being a distinction being made, or?
See, every time somebody asks a question about this project, I'm like, oh, we didn't think of that.
Because that is something that, like, when you hear fountain, like, that you
Yes.
automatically think of these decorative, grandiose, like, places you go and hang out.
We haven't so far. But now that you bring it up, we probably should, except it's a later history. In fact, my understanding, I mean, from the data that I can think of right now, most of the fountains that were turned into much more monumental, glorifying objects date now from the 19th century. So that's slightly, after what we're looking at. And there is a lot of literature on that. And I think that my instinct so far, but it's really an instinct, not even a thought, is that I don't want to fall back into that visible and over visible, in a sense, aspect. I want to keep this underground, subterranean theme as the center of our attention. And there's also a lot of literature on, the presence and the significance, including symbolic, of monumental fountains in the 19th and 20th century. So I never thought of that, but probably a very interesting way in which one could look at that is, when is it that these objects of civic identity, and that were clearly, sober objects that would remind you of the infrastructure themselves rather than of other things and deities and rulers, actually changed into this other, that is interesting. And yeah, we haven't done it yet. Like, add another line to that to-do list.
So I was going to ask Sara first if Maria de Medici had brought with her any Florentine notions of how to get water to the city, and whether she was encouraged to or prevented from doing so. But I think your question of the subterranean is probably even more interesting. And my question there would be whether there's evidence that that hydraulic engineering from the Florentine experience of the 16th century informed these projects that you looked at. And the other question I have for you is your mention of the social history regarding the Seine and its vicissitudes. Are you intending with your students to explore a correlation of some sort between the social history of the city and the history of these aquatic works? Yes. And if so, what are your incipient directions?
Yes. So first, to your first question, yes, it was in fact an Italian hydraulic engineer who designed that network, and his name was Tommaso Francini, and he belonged to a family of, then very successful hydraulic engineers based in France of Italian origins. But Maria de Medici was much smarter than we tend to think of her, and so she didn't bring him in. She convinced her husband before he died to bring him in. So in fact, Francini was paid by the royal coffers instead of her own personal finances, which is, of course, a sign of intelligence. I mean, we should remember that, she was a widow, she was a regent, so she didn't really have access to the royal coffers. So that is important in when we look at the projects that women financed. It's important to remember that their ability to put together money was not the same as their royal husbands. To your second question, yes, I think that ideally what I'd like to do once we have figured out these infrastructures is actually to look at social studies on the population, on density, and those exist. We don't have to go, back to the archives, and see whether this matches. The development of the left bank of the city seems to me to really follow the appearance and the development of infrastructure that are of a variety of kinds, but mostly, in fact, subterranean, and all of them related to water in a way or another, including the bridges that I were mentioning. So I think the hypothesis is that we will see sort of a matching progress of ways in which the city can develop and does develop. But of course, until we do that overlap, I don't know. But I kind of expect to find that in some, for some parts of the city, particularly in northeast, where that we're sort of served by what are referred to as the northern sources, which is a strange combination of freshwater sources that are brought in through an aqueduct, but in a kind of it works one day, not the next kind of way. It's a very fragile system. Actually, social historians have looked at that, and they have found almost a one-to-one correspondence to the ability, in fact, of controlling the regularity of this access to water with the influx of, urbanization, population of certain areas of the city.
So you're really looking at possible history of water equity.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm talking decades ahead at this speed.
I think that, yes. Can I just ask, are there more questions? Because I think we're running out of time. So, okay, let's take three. So we can take three. Let's just take three.
First, I just wanted to thank you for your really, really interesting talks. I've never thought of, I guess, these kinds of questions before. But I think what I wanted to ask both of you, just throughout your work, have you kind of come to realize maybe any differences between the relationship that the city of Paris has to its sources of water and maybe other European capitals or other cities in general? In what ways is Paris's relationship to the Seine and just water generally different, and how has it shaped Paris or France in ways that maybe other cities haven't seen? I was just curious.
You can go first. I go first. Should we take them all together?
Yes.
All the questions. Okay.
Thank you both for your excellent talks. I was wondering, this question is for Anne-Gaëlle. I'm curious about the relationship spatially between the morgue, which seems to be capital T, the morgue. Also how it facilitated processing so many bodies if it was just one singular space. So the morgue in relationship distance to the Seine itself, or versus cemeteries, and then also if it was still operational at the time, the École de Chirurgie, and how that fits into the story of the Inconnu in terms of this kind of theatrical representation of death and exposition, and also rising scientific analyses of the body and investigations, enlightenment into the corpse.
Yeah, the morgue, the glass house, right? What was when was this happening chronologically?
In the 19th century.
And what was the population of Paris and the environs at that time?
Ooh, that's a good question for you.
The reason I'm asking is, if I heard you correctly, this was like going to the zoo, and a million people showed up.
Yes.
And was there any social commentary about that? I thought the catacombs were pretty weird.
They're weird. I don't like them.
Okay, so how should we go? Who wants to go go fast to wrap up.
I'll go.
Where was it physically? You know, on the map.
The morgue, it was very close to Notre-Dame de Paris. It's very close. It was Clé de l'Archevêché, which is like very close to l'Île Saint-Louis. It's like this very central. It's the heart. The middle, yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's a good answer. So, I mean, it doesn't exist anymore. As I said, it was closed in 1907 because the authorities just could not tolerate anymore the kind of exhibition of naked bodies. But there were, I mean, I could have had an entire paper on that, and hours would not have sufficed. I mean, I found so many newspapers articles about the morgue, so many commentators, even poetry, ballads about the morgue on the Seine, Champfleury ballads. You know, it's like a ton. It's really, it comes to, all these materials comes to constitute a discourse in the Foucauldian sense, that it's really a discourse about the city. It's what, you know, it says a lot about how how Paris was perceived, and I really think it was very specific to that city. Yes, I know it's always surprising because we have such a different relation to death, but you should also not forget that in the 19th century, death was extremely commonly displayed on present physically, because the whole kind of health system was different, because there was just not, you know, I mean, accidents will happen much more often. The mortality rate was enormous. So, and the anonymity of the masses made it, you know, kind of a necessity to have a place where to identify the corpses. So yes, it was close to the Seine. And yes, it was very different from a cemetery, because a cemetery would be traditionally rather more outside of the city, where in the case of Paris it's not really true. But I think it was really different because of its centrality, and it's the fact that, you know, things were changing all the time. You have this very famous passage in Zola's Thérèse Raquin, you know, like a naturalist novel, in which the narrator compares the morgue to theater. And he says what's good is, like, you know, there are weeks it's good and weeks it's not good, because weeks you have interesting bodies, weeks there are, you know, there's not enough people, well, or they're not interesting. So it's...
So to answer your question, I think that in my experience at least, the subterranean is subterranean to everywhere. So whenever you have a city that has a river, no matter what relationship, what physical relationship it has with its river, you will see or hear this water come back. And like, just an example, you go to the National Library in Florence, you order whatever manuscript, and at some point it will happen. If you order enough books, they will come and tell you, oh, this was flooded in 66, we can't give it to you. It's so, you know, there's a way in which cities are always affected by the presence of water through time into the very material aspects of the historical record, right? You can't read that book because it was flooded in 1966, right? So, but then I would say, again, you know, thinking of the comparison between Florence and Paris, that relationship with its water that each city develops is almost always like a single case, right? So for instance, I don't know if you've ever been to Florence, but one of the quarters of Florence, it's called Oltrarno. You know, it's where the Pitti Palace is, and literally it means beyond the Arno River. So that already tells you that Florence has this relationship with its own river that is that of a city that is on one side of the river, and then there is this beyond the river one neighborhood, right? And that is a very peculiar way of conceiving as a city your own identity in terms of vicinity with water, because of course the Arno River functioned in many ways, in the same way in which the Seine worked, right? So there were like building construction materials would come through the Arno, food, wine. I mean, you know, And yet there is this retreating almost, or keeping your distance from the river attitude. And Paris, in fact, was on the brink of that, right? I mean, when we look at the city at the end of the 16th century, where you see this large developed urban center on to the north of it, and then this much smaller and much more rarefied plains south of it, I mean, it could have gone the Florence direction, right? It could have become a city next to a river with one neighborhood or two beyond the Seine, which probably would have also taken that name. So, yeah. But Paris actually ends up being a city on the river. And in fact, it has a lot to do with the visibility of it. The bridges that were built in the 17th century were bridges that were clear of houses, and people all of a sudden realized that there was nothing that said Royal Festival more than having it on a bridge with a view of the entire city and the river behind it. So this visibility, this visuality, I think it's immediately perceived as something that can be put to use. And that's how, in fact, the structure of the city itself changes. But I think it's a very personal, not personal, but like case by case, in fact, with a substratum of common incidents and accidents. I think that the stories of the drowned is a story that pretty much is the story of any city that is near a body of water, be it a river or the sea, right? So. Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.